Okay, today we're going to talk about program outcomes, how we identify, how we measure, how we work through that from an evaluation standpoint, the outcomes that were identified by our program evaluators. Think back to Kirkpatrick's level of evidence that we talked about earlier in the semester. This is the pyramid, right? So program conceptualization and design is at the bottom of that pyramid. That's where the evaluator works very closely with the program manager to make sure that the program is being designed appropriately, that we've got uh, things in place that we can measure. Program monitoring is where this is the purely formative evaluation where we're monitoring the program as it's being delivered to make sure that we're following the plan, that we're teaching appropriately, that we're reaching the appropriate target audience, all those sorts of things you as an evaluator would consider in program monitoring. Today, we'll talk more about impact and outcome evaluation. And then cost evaluation goes right along with that. And typically one leads to the other, right? So if we have solid impacts and outcomes, oftentimes we'll have an economic impact. But the cost evaluation also looks at how effectively the program utilizes resources. But today we're going to focus on impact and outcome evaluation. Okay, it's good to go back, to review, to think about this definition of a program. It's very important. It's never a single activity. It's a comprehensive set of activities, events, and experiences that lead to intended results. And those intended results are where we'll focus a whole lot today because that's what we're measuring in an outcome evaluation. So what an outcome evaluation is a systematic look at whether this program has had its intended effects on the clients or on the social condition that we intended to impact. In other words, did we do what we said we were going to do? It's all about accountability. And the definition of accountability from our perspective is doing what you said you were going to do. Okay. So think about outcomes as being observed characteristics of the population or the social condition. That's what we're measuring. So let's look at intended results and let's think about them in groups. Okay, there's a group of learning results. That would be knowledge, attitudes, and skills. Knowledge is simply that. Did we increase what someone knows about this topic? Attitudes would be, did we change the way they think about this? Did we increase the level of importance in someone's mind about this particular topic? And then a skill would be something that we could teach immediately that could lead, often would lead to a change in behavior or an adoption of a practice. And that's where these fall. So the next group is application. That's always going to be an adoption of best practice or technology or a behavior change. They're going to happen in order. You're going to have some changes, some intended results from the first group before you get application. So they're going to typically have to learn something, maybe change an attitude, maybe learn a skill before they can adopt a best practice or behave or change that behavior. So those are going to go in order. Think about them this way. You can have uh, really solid intended results in a very short term period of time in that first group. Okay. We can measure participation. Are they satisfied? Are they coming? Are they participating in the program? Are they using our products and services? Very immediately we can determine, did we change someone's knowledge about this? Oftentimes we can measure attitudes and skills very short term and maybe some minor behavior changes. So those are short term. The longer term intended results are going to be behavior change, adoption of best practices. Those are going to impact economic changes and prevalence and mortality. So those are things that are going to be much longer term, and think about your intended results in those time frames. So here's things to think about from an outcome. There's 3 levels I want you to think about. Number 1 is the outcome level. That's the status of that outcome at some point in time. So think of it, let's just go through this from a knowledge standpoint. What does our target audience know about this topic before the program begins? That's an outcome level status at that point in time. Okay. What they know about the program after the event is also an outcome level, and the difference between those two is the outcome change. So we measure their knowledge about what we're teaching before, we measure their knowledge about what we taught afterwards. We've got two levels, two outcome levels. The difference between those outcome levels is the outcome change, and that we can take credit for that outcome change. That becomes the program effect. Things you want to consider from an impact or an outcome evaluation standpoint is, did the program hit its intended results? Did we do what we said we were going to do? Can we determine what part of that we should take credit for? Because there could be other things that impacts our target audience or our social condition during the course of our educational program that we can't take credit for, right? There could be weather events, social events, unintended or unanticipated events that happen that we can't take credit for. And then we need to be able to identify what those factors are and be able to explain the impact that they might have had on the educational program or on the results of our educational program. The way that we do it, the way that we measure is primarily there's two major ways. So probably the best is to compare participants to non-participants. It's also the hardest, right? Because you're basically trying to find two groups of people that are very similar in their knowledge level, their educational level, their social status, their income, their race and gender and age, and all those kinds of things. We want them to be pretty similar. So you got two groups. One would go through your educational program, one would not. At the end, you would compare the difference between the two groups on those topics, on those intended outcomes of the program. Okay, that can be pretty difficult to have two groups that you can compare. More often, and what most of you would include in your evaluation plan, is that we're going to compare our participants over time. So we're not going to compare non-participants. We're just going to look at our participants, and we're going to say before the program, we're going to describe them. We're going to measure them throughout the program, and then after the program, we're going to describe them again and say this is the change that occurred over that period of time on these participants. So that's going to be the most common. It's also simpler, but it's effective if we do a good job at it. Okay. Everything we do is going to be tied right back to the objectives of the educational program. Whatever we measure is going to be tied back to what we identified in the planning phase of those intended results. And then some different ways that you can measure, and I would tell you that you're going to utilize probably all of these in your evaluation plan, would be a pre-post. Okay, so to measure knowledge, there's no better way than a pre-test and a post-test. You measure what they know about a topic before the educational program, and this could be a single activity. And then you teach the subject, and at the end you give them a test and you compare the difference. Okay, I could do this at the beginning of every class period. I could measure what you know about a topic that I'm going to teach. I could teach the topic. I could give you the same test at the end and compare what you learned. Doesn't mean you retained it, but it means that you learned it right away. Okay, so pre-post, great way to measure knowledge. Post only is ask, and retrospective posts, they're very similar. That's asking our participants, based on what you learn, based on this educational program, how much more do you know about this topic? How much did you learn related to this topic? What did you know before? What do you know after? So rather than doing two tests, we're just giving them one, but asking them to compare what they knew before and what they know after, how they behave before, how they behave after. So it's just asking them to be retrospective in terms of what they're reporting to us. And then more importantly, oftentimes is a long-term follow-up. People do a great job of making an immediate change at the end of an educational program, but will they maintain that behavior, right? So 6 or 9 or 12 months later is ideal to do a long-term follow-up and determine this is what you said you were going to do at the end of the program. Did you do it, and have you continued to do it? Because that's where we have true impact from our educational programs, is sustained behavior change. So the only way to know if it was sustained is to do a long-term follow-up. Excuse me. So some things to consider that could have an impact on your evaluation would be things like secular trends. This is just things going on in society, right? So it could be something that's driven by the media, by social media. It could be just something that's going on in a community. Maybe there's some upheaval in a community, related to there's been an event, something that impacts the way people think about whatever it is that we're trying to teach. Maybe there's been some violence, or there's been a string of you know unlawful events of some sort. There's been a spike in some sort of crime. Anything like that could have an effect on your educational program. Okay, so you need to be aware of those kinds of things. So secular trends and interfering events kind of go hand in hand. Maturational trends, particularly important if your audience is youth. But just think about if you're doing a program that's going to last 9 months or a year, and your target audience is third grade kids. Well, there's a lot of change in a third grade kid over a year, right? Just naturally, there's things that they're learning outside of your educational program that's changing their maturity level. Could be things they're learning in school, things they're picking up from their friends. Maybe they're in other after school programs and events. They're participating in other programs or extracurricular events where there's just changes that happen to those kids over a period of your 1 year educational program. You can't take credit for everything. So that's where we got to think about, and be able to describe what our program did, the impact that we truly had. Uncontrolled selection simply means that most of our programs are open to all. We know who our target audience is, and we've described them, and we know who we want to reach, but there may be people that participate who are not part of that target audience. So, maybe somebody, if we're trying if our program is aimed at teaching people how to irrigate their home landscape, maybe we got people that are already doing most of the practices that we want to teach. They show up because they want to sharpen their skills. They want to learn a little more. It's great. We don't mind them being there. It's wonderful that they're participating. But then at the end, when we ask about the change in behavior, well, they were already doing it before. So that's going to have a negative impact on your results. It's not a net negative because they still learn something, but it's hard. You have to be able to explain that we had some people that participated that were already doing this, that participate in our program because they wanted to be better at it. They wanted to learn more about it. So uncontrolled selection is something that you often will deal with. Things you have to consider: reliability and validity. That basically means that reliability talks about if we were to do this program year after year and we were to evaluate it year after year, utilizing the same program delivery plans and methods and the same evaluation methods, that if we had the correct target audience, we would get similar results year after year. That means that what we're doing is reliable. What we're teaching and what we're measuring has a high level of reliability. Validity says that we're measuring what we're teaching, that we don't have an evaluation that's measuring one thing while our program deliverers are teaching something different. So validity means that we are tied directly back to the intended results, and that what's being taught ties directly to the intended results. So they're going hand in hand. The poor choice of outcome measures, that kind of ties back to validity. What that means, though, is that in the planning phase, whoever's doing the evaluation and whoever's doing the program development and teaching are working hand in hand to make sure that the outcome measures are appropriate and something that could be measured. Okay, so that's something that goes back to the planning phase. Hawthorne effect, particularly effective with kids, or impacts with kids, but could be with adults as well. What this says is that if you're utilizing Observation is one of your data collection methods, and we're going to get into data collection methods next week. But if you're using observation, this says that people will behave differently when they know they're being observed. Okay. Adults will typically behave better. They want to, if they know that somebody's observing them, though, they're going to try to do what they think the observer is expecting to see. Kids, on the other hand, might be the opposite. They might act out a little more if they're being observed. Doesn't matter whether they're behaving better or worse. They're behaving differently. That's what the Hawthorne effect says, and that's important to be able to note and to describe and to think about when you're talking about how we're going to observe it. Okay. Delivery contamination basically means that whoever you've got delivering the educational content didn't do so according to plan. Okay, that means you've done a great job of planning and putting together the information. It's all tied back to the intended results, and then whoever goes and teaches it doesn't do it correctly. That's delivery contamination. And then missing information just means they skipped something. A really important part of the educational plan wasn't included, wasn't delivered, wasn't taught. We're going to get to the end and measure that, and you're going to have poor results because they didn't get it. They were never taught that information. Those are things that you need to consider and think about when you're putting your evaluation plan together, because they could all have an effect on the results. So let's talk about program outcomes. So a program outcome is the most important part of an evaluator's plan. It's the most important part of what an evaluator does. It's the key component of all impact evaluations is measuring what those outcomes are. And again, we're going to talk about some of the characteristics and some of the specific things related to program outcomes. So outcomes will focus on a target population or a social condition. The outcome that we've identified says that we're going to change this about the social condition, or we're going to change this behavior, this knowledge, this skill, this attitude in our target audience, right? Those are the conditions that we say that we're going to change. It's not the outputs. The outputs are the things that we do to try to reach the outcomes. Those are the individual activities and events that we do to try to reach the outcomes, but don't confuse outcomes and outputs. So, and the other thing that you have to think about is that when you get to the end, there may not be change. Change may not have occurred, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you need to be able to explain and describe what you found and why you think you found it. We just talked about this a minute ago, but there's three things that you got to think about: outcome level, the outcome change, that's the difference between those two levels, beginning and end or whatever, and then the program effect is that difference between where we started and where we ended. Okay. If you want to look at it on a graph, here's a great example. So at the very beginning, this is an outcome level. Okay. This is where we are before the program. Here's an outcome level at the end, right? This is what we're measuring during in that gray box is during the program. That's what we're measuring. And then over time, you can measure your participants to non-participants out on the far right side of that graph. The distance between those two lines is the program effect. So you've got outcome level at the beginning where everybody's in about the same place, right? This is saying that we have two different groups. We go through the educational program. At the end, there's a difference. Okay, the people that went through our program, they begin to escalate to be higher up that graph than the non-participants, and then over time, there's a gap between those two, between participants and non-participants. That's the effect of our program. Those are the difference in those outcome levels. When we're identifying outcomes, we have to think about our stakeholders, right? We have to think about the various stakeholders and know that they're going to have different perspectives and different understandings of what our program is designed to do. Okay, so you may have different outcomes. Different stakeholders may have different ideas of what the outcome should be. You've got to understand that and know that we may measure things differently for one group of stakeholders as opposed to another, or report things differently for one group of stakeholders as opposed to another. Here's a couple of terms that we haven't talked about. Okay, so we're going to talk about the program impact theory. We know that that's the program development process. We know that that's something that is very important in the beginning, and that evaluation needs to be a part of that when we're identifying those outcomes. We looked a while ago at short-term and long-term outcomes, right? Knowledge, skills, attitudes being short-term. Think about those as being more proximal, okay? So proximal outcomes are the easiest to measure. Those are typically the shorter term outcomes. Those are things that our evaluation will directly measure with program participants. Those are proximal outcomes. The other new term here to think about is distal outcomes. Those, think of distal as being more distant, being more long term. Okay, I'm gonna give you an example of an educational program we did in Austin that had very proximal and very distal outcomes. There was a neighborhood in Austin. The program was called Grow Green. There was a neighborhood in Austin that had about 250 homes. Those 250 homes were in a common watershed. In other words, when it rained or when there was some sort of runoff, all that water basically went into one stream, and then that stream had a capture pond in a city park that was a part of that neighborhood. Well, that capture pond in that city park had really high levels of nitrates. So the water quality was very low. It was a concern, the city had done some testing, and it was a concern there with that level of nitrates, that if there was overflow, that you would have contaminated water running into other water sources within the city. So they wanted to address that. They came to us, to Extension, to develop a plan to address that. Well, what we put together was a program called Grow Green, that we knew that, if you got high nitrate levels in a pond that's coming from one typical watershed, it's probably coming from over fertilization, right? People aren't fertilizing correctly. So what we put together was a plan to teach those 250-ish homeowners. There was also a city park. There was also a small golf course. So all of those people that were managing uh, yards and parks and turf in that area, teach them how to properly sample, pull soil samples, and then to fertilize based on those soil samples. So to determine the proper amounts of fertility, the proper formulation of fertility, and then also the proper time to fertilize. So not to fertilize right before a big rainfall event, but rather to fertilize, water it in slowly so that when the big rainfall event comes, it doesn't wash it away, right? So we went through the process and did that educational program. So the proximal outcomes were very simple. Did we increase people's knowledge about why that's important? Did we change their attitude about the importance of proper fertilization? Did we get them to change their behavior about how they fertilize? Did they adopt the practice of soil sampling? Those were all proximal outcomes. The distal outcomes were the ones that were more important to our city stakeholders, and that is, did we decrease nitrates in the stream and in the surface water in that pond? So that's going to be longer term. You're not going to see an immediate decrease in something like that. So the proximal outcomes were immediate, and we could we could measure and see success and talk about how how effective the program was at the things that we identified: knowledge, skills, attitude, behavior. Okay, we can measure all those, and those were proximal, short term. Distal outcomes were those longer term. We had to come back and continue to monitor those nitrate levels for years following that program, to see if we were started to see a decline. And the answer was yes, we did. It was an effective program, both proximally and distally, in terms of those outcomes. But you need to know those terms and think about the timing of those outcomes, proximal and distal. Okay, it's also important as you're putting together your plan to think about, you're not the first person to do this, most likely. Whatever the educational program is that you're looking at evaluating, there probably have been similar programs and similar evaluations conducted prior to you. So do a little research, find where there might have been similar programs where uh, uh, there's been an evaluation conducted that's similar to the one that you're designing, and just see what worked, what didn't, what some outcome measures were from the previous program that you might need to consider putting into this one, right? So that uh, you're utilizing what others have learned before you, so that you don't make the same mistakes. Okay, and then again, we'll think about unintended effects. And we've talked about this a little bit, but those unintended effects can be positive or negative. They can be very difficult to anticipate. You don't always know what's going to happen. And I'll go back to that program in Austin, the Grow Green program. Um, an unintended effect could very well have been a really wet year, right? Or a really dry year. A really wet year, though, you're going to have more runoff. Okay, so um, even if people are fertilizing correctly and they're trying to do it at the right time, if you have a flood event, a really heavy rainfall event, you're still going to get some runoff and you're going to get peaks in those nitrate levels that we're monitoring. So that's a negative effect. It's unintended. We had no idea that it was coming. People were probably still doing things for the most part right, but there was an unanticipated weather event that caused a peak and had some negative impacts on the program. You just need to be able to identify those and describe those. So prioritization of outcomes, not every outcome will be identified through the procedures we've described. Okay, so there may be some outcomes that we need to think about and say, there's going to be other things that show up, but the most important ones are these. These are the outcomes that we want to make sure that we measure no matter what. These are the most important outcomes. Okay. Um, think about the way that you build your evaluation to make sure that those most important outcomes that we've identified, the ones that could have the biggest impact, are the ones that, number one, we're focusing the teaching on, but we're also focusing our evaluation and our measurement on. Let's put our resources where they can have the most impact, right? Again, we're going to talk way, way, way more in depth about data collection methods, but uh, some of the ways that we'll measure will be things like observation, looking at previous records and current records, uh, interviews and questionnaires and surveys and focus groups. All those will be data collection methods that will be built into your plan. So you need to start thinking about those. An evaluation plan will never have a single method of data collection. You're going to have multiple methods of data collection because people respond differently. People will open up differently based on where they're more comfortable sharing information. Okay, so we will have multiple ways that we measure these program outcomes. Okay, we've talked a little bit about this, but reliability is the measure of the extent to which we'll get the same results if we use this evaluation over again with a different with a different audience. Okay, so reliability, we want that to be very high. A retest method of measuring reliability is the most appropriate way to do this. So basically, we're going to test it, we're going to retest it, and we're going to see if we got similar results. Test it with one group, retest with another group, and see if we have similar results. Great way to measure whether or not we have a reliable method of gathering data. Okay, we talked a little bit about validity earlier. This is it's more difficult of a problem than reliability. Validity is the measure of the extent to which it measures what it's intended to measure. Are we Is our evaluation measuring what the program is teaching? Validity turns out to depend very much on whether measures accepted as valid by appropriate stakeholders. So empirical demonstrations of the validity of a measure depend on some comparison that shows that the measure yields the results expected as if it were indeed valid. Okay. Face validity is one of the best ways to measure that, and that's where you would have a group of experts, somebody that's that would be considered an expert in this field would look at our measures and say, yeah, those are in fact valid. They are measuring what we're teaching. So we have face validity. Okay, that's probably the most important and the most appropriate way that you're going to do that with your methods is to have that included in your plan, to have a panel of experts look at your evaluation tools and instruments and make sure that they're valid. The sensitivity of a measure is the extent to which the values on the measure change when there is a change or difference in the thing being measured. There are two main ways in which the kinds of outcome measures frequently used in program evaluation can be insensitive to changes or differences of the magnitude the program might produce. First, the measure may include elements that relate to something other than what the program could reasonably be expected to change. Second, the outcome measure may be insensitive to the kinds of changes or differences induced by the program when they were developed largely for diagnostic purposes, that is to detect individual differences. Okay, so what we're saying is the measures that we put out may not be sensitive enough to potential changes that the program should have an impact on. Selecting the best measures for assessing outcomes is a critical measurement problem in evaluation. I would recommend that evaluators invest the necessary time and resources to develop and test appropriate outcome measures. A poorly conceptualized outcome measure may not properly represent the goals and objectives of the program. It may not be based on what the program is teaching. So it may lead to questions about the validity of the measure. It may lead to an unreliable or insufficiently sensitive measure that will underestimate the effectiveness of the program and lead to incorrect conclusions about its impact. So we may get to the end and realize we didn't have good outcome measures. We weren't measuring them appropriately. There's really no way to know whether this program was effective or not. So we can waste a tremendous amount of time and resources if we're not very, very thoughtful in terms of our choice. With adequate measures of significant program outcomes in hand, you can use various ways to, you or the program managers can use various ways to learn things about the performance of the program, right? So the simplest application is outcome monitoring. It's just defining, it's the regular measurement and reporting of indicators of the status that individuals and social conditions are having based on this program. So we're going to be looking at this throughout the program and determining, are we making an impact? Are we seeing a change in either our target audience or on the social condition? Outcome monitoring requires that measures be identified for important program outcomes that are practical to collect routinely and informative with regard to the performance of the program. In other words, are they readily available, and are they going to give us a clear picture of what the change that's occurring is? The outcome measures that serve as indicators for use in outcome monitoring schemes, they should be responsive as possible to program influences. So the most interpretable outcome indicators are those that involve characteristics or behaviors that only the program is likely to have affected to any degree. Okay, so we're going to make sure that what we're measuring ties directly back to what we're teaching so that we're measuring something that we most likely had an impact on. One important consideration is that any outcome indicator to which program funders or other influential decision makers give serious attention will also inevitably receive emphasis from program staff and managers. If the outcome indicators are not appropriate or fail to cover important outcomes Efforts to improve the performance they reflect may distort program activities. So, in other words, what we're expecting to see may cause us to focus on the wrong thing, right? A related problem is the corruptibility of indicators. This refers to the natural tendency for those whose performance is being evaluated to attempt to skew the indicators in a favorable direction. Are we going to teach over and over and over something that we know we're going to measure and skip over some things that could be very important, right? So, as program developers and program implementers, are we going to do things that would intentionally try to skew the results? Another pitfall has to do with the interpretation of the outcome indicator data. Given a range of factors other than program performance that may influence those indicators, interpretations made out of context can be misleading, and even with proper context, they can be difficult, right? Outcome data collected through routine outcome monitoring can be especially difficult to interpret if we don't have the accompanying information about changes in the client mix, relevant demographic, local economic trends, and that sort of thing. So, making sure that we have all the information when we're trying to interpret data is really important. Similarly, outcome data usually are more interpretable when we have information about program process and service utilization. So, we want to make sure that we have all the information about the target audience, about the program, and how it was delivered when we're trying to interpret what the outcomes are. So it's a fair amount of data for you to think about this week, or content for you to think about this week. There's more coming. So next week, we're going to talk about how we collect data, some of those data collection methods. Um, After that, and then we'll talk about how we design instruments. So, by the time we get to, let's say, the week of October 21, you basically will have all the information you need to begin putting together your plan. I laid out what some of the contents of an evaluation plan are. I'll put out a grading rubric. I'll put out a one pager that will help you begin to put together your evaluation plan. But you'll have the information that you need here in a couple of weeks, everything that you would need to put together your plan. So I would start thinking now about your program that you've identified. Make sure that you're focused enough that what you've got is going to be appropriate. If you're not sure, don't hesitate to shoot me an email or a text, and let's visit about it. If you're not sure, the thing that'll probably have more impact on your success than anything else is making sure that you've got the right program selected that you can appropriately develop an evaluation plan for. So let's get that right. Then we'll start thinking about how we implement this plan, or how we build this plan to evaluate the program that you've identified. Thanks and gig 'em. See you soon.